Let me just say this. All of the research into Harvey and Lee, everything I've accomplished, could end with one DNA test. And of course, that's between any member of Robert Oswald's family and any member of Marina's family. If those DNA tests were to show that those people are not related, then you have Harvey and you have Lee, who are not brothers.
I'm playing approximately 1 hour of a 7-hour interview I did with John Armstrong. The book is Harvey and Lee.
A lot of my work came from records in the Warren volumes that contradicted themselves. You've got just record after record of contradictions. And they were published in the Warren volumes. We all know about the duplications of Oswald being at the shooting range when he's supposed to be in Irving with his wife before the assassination. We all know about, we should know about the Curtin Rod story with Ralph Leon Yates picking up a hitchhiker on the Thornton Freeway and dropping him off at the Texas School Book Depository. I believe it was the day before the assassination. He had a package and he told Yates he was carrying curtain rods during the time of which Harvey was working at the School Book Depository. We know about the incident at the downtown Lincoln Mercury buying a car, the shooting range, Sportstrom rifle range when Oswald's, supposedly at a different location. All these things are duplications. All these things should have been investigated. Is there one that sticks out more than another? A good example would be Alan Feld. Alan Feld gave a detailed interview to the FBI. And Alan Feld said that he was with Oswald, and this is from memory, but the man's name is Alan Feld. And Feld said that he was with Oswald at boot camp and ITR training, and then they went to radar school, and then they went to aviation electronics school in Memphis, Tennessee. He last saw Oswald in September of 1957. He first met Oswald in Camp Pendleton, California, in the fall of 1956, ITR training in Jacksonville, and then Biloxi Radar School, and then Aviation Electronics School in Memphis, Tennessee. There's no indication in any Marine Corps records, Marine Corps unit diaries, anywhere of Oswald attending a school in Memphis, Tennessee, and especially in June and July and August, because in June and July and August, Oswald took his leave and went to Fort Worth with his mother. He came back to El Toro, California, where he stayed for a few weeks. Then he was loaded onto the USS Bexar in late August en route to Japan. In fact, the last of August, I can't remember the date, he actually mailed a postcard from Honolulu to his mother at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. Well, then here's Alan Feld saying that he was with Oswald at Aviation Electronics School in Memphis, Tennessee, until September. It's pretty obvious something's wrong. Another one, another very, very good one, duplication, is the radar school. Daniel Patrick Powers talks about leaving Jacksonville with Lee Oswald to the Warren Commission. He talks about leaving on May the 3rd from Jacksonville en route to Biloxi. And Powers brought his Marine Corps orders to the Warren Commission. And what was interesting is Powers said that his squadron was Squadron 3383. Now that's interesting because that's not what the Commission records say. Commission records say it was Squadron 3381. Now Powers' Marine orders, which were for him as the leader of these 6 Marines, and himself included, he was given the class to attend. The class number was AB 27037. Now, the Commission says that the class Oswald attended was AB 27330, a different number. Then you've got the class number, which Powers says was 0805. Commission says 24047. So, I don't know what's going on, but you've got 2 different records for 2 different people attending the Biloxi radar school, the radar school at Biloxi. Now, what's interesting is that there's a fellow named Sherman Cooley. Sherman was interviewed by a JFK researcher quite a few years ago, And he explained something that was not given to us through the Warren Commission. He said basically that the Platoon 1000 series went to radar school first, and they were followed by people in the 2000 series. What that means is that Lee Oswald, with Daniel Patrick Powers, had to be in the Platoon 1000 series. And a week or so later, the Platoon 2000, which Harvey Oswald, was in Platoon 2060. His photograph is in the Platoon 2060 yearbook. So we know he was in the 2060 yearbook. Now, how do we know when Harvey attended school? Look at the interview with Dujanovic. Dujanovic says that he attended radar school with Oswald beginning May 13th. And that radar school ended approximately June 28th. So you have Lee Oswald and Daniel Patrick Powers attending radar school on May 4th, and you have Dujanovic attending school with Harvey on May 13th. That should have been investigated by the Warren Commission. That's just one example of records that are crossed. Another record that's just probably the record that shocked me the most, or made me really sit up in my chair, was when I spoke with the Fort Worth Independent School District. I'd read in Robert Oswald's testimony that his brother went to Stripling Junior High School in Fort Worth. Now, we know, according to Warren Commission records, that Oswald never attended junior high in Fort Worth. He left Fort Worth after graduating from Ridgely West Elementary School in the spring of 1952. He allegedly went to New York, lived with his brother John Pick, attended Trinity Evangelical School for a few weeks in New York, and then he went to public school, and then Public School 44 for the remainder of his time in New York. And then he left in January of 1954 and went to Beauregard and graduated from Beauregard in the spring of 1955. And then he actually attended, briefly, Warren Easton High School in the fall of 1955. So Oswald never should have attended junior high in Fort Worth. So here's Robert Oswald saying to the Warren Commission he attended Stripling Junior High. So I wrote a letter to the principal. I called Stripling, found out who the principal was, wrote a letter. His name was Ricardo Galindo. I wrote a letter to Mr. Galindo, and I simply said, Mr. Galindo, here's the testimony from Robert Oswald saying that he went to Stripling. Here's an article when Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, and Robert Oswald says he attended Stripling. Another article that said Oswald attended Stripling. Mr. Galindo called me on the phone, and he was very nice, and he said, yes, Oswald attended Stripling. And I said, how do you know? And he said, it's common knowledge. All of the teachers here know it. And I said, well, that's fine. Are any of the teachers there that were there in 1954 when Oswald allegedly attended school? Nope, they're not. He said, why don't you go down to the Fort Worth Independent School District and find out who taught there in 1954. So I went down to the Fort Worth Independent School District. They were very nice. They told them what I wanted. And just so happens that a man named, I believe his name is Billy Sills, I'm not sure if that's right, but he was kind of a archivist for the Fort Worth Independent School District. He didn't get paid for it. It was kind of like me doing the JFK research. You just do it because that's what you want to do. You enjoy it. So this man, within just a few hours, came back with a list, a handwritten list, which he gave me, of all the teachers that had taught at Stripling in 1954. And I was pleasantly surprised. And I started calling these people. And one by one, over half of them said, the person you need to talk to is Frank Cudlady. I said, okay. I talked to Mark Summers, who was a gym teacher. And Mark Summers told me that, yes, Oswald did attend. He was in his gym class. And I said, could it have been Robert? And he says, no. He said, my first year at Stripling, I believe he said was 1952. And he said, Oswald was there in my gym class a couple of years after I started. I looked back and found out that Robert Oswald had left for the Marines in 1952. And Robert had attended Stripling in 1949, long before Mark Summers was there. So
he wouldn't have got him mixed up.
No, he would not have gotten him mixed up. So then Mark Summers referred me once again to Frank Cudlady. Well, I finally called Mr. Cudlady and introduced myself, and I just bluntly asked him. I said, Mr. Cudlady, I'm a JFK researcher. I'm researching Lee Harvey Oswald. I've talked to a number of people who taught at Stripling who said, you're the man with the answer. He said, well, how can I help you? And I said, well, did Oswald attend Stripling? And he said, sure, he attended Stripling. And I was shocked, and I said, how do you know that? And then Frank said, because I gave his records to the FBI. Now, I tape recorded that phone call. Oswald was there. I gave the records to the FBI the day after the assassination. My principal called me in the morning, 7 o'clock, said, go to school, get Oswald's records, give them to the FBI. So then what I have, and I asked him, when was it? And he says he thinks it was 1954. Then I've got, and this man was the superintendent of the Waco School District. He was an educator all of his life. He was one of 13 people selected by the United States Educational Society to go to China to advise them on education in the late 1970s. I mean, his academic credentials are pretty strong. So I thought, okay, now we've got a pretty good indication that Oswald, or a solid indication that Oswald attended Stripling. I asked Frank if he looked at the grades, looked at the attendance record, and he says he remembered that Oswald attended one semester, but he had not completed the second grade period, which would have meant one semester. So he dropped out sometime during the second semester. And if you've researched Harvey like I have, you'll know that Harvey has this pattern in Harvey's life of attending a school, not having previous transcripts from the previous school, generally means that the school would not let him stay, and he doesn't complete school. The same thing happened in Beauregard, same thing happened in New York City. I believe the same thing happened at Warren Easton High School, the same thing in Arlington Heights High School. This is a person who just never had the records forwarded to the next school. For example, he goes to New York. Where are the records from Ridgely West Elementary School? There aren't any. And Frank Cudlady told me how that was done. He said the records are always done in duplicate, so that we always send the duplicate to the new school. But both of Oswald's records were there, and we never received anything from the previous school showing where Oswald had come from. But he said, I gave those records to the FBI, they thanked me, and they left. And I locked up the school and I went home. So that's one of the best indications that there were two Lee Harvey Oswalds in junior high school.
Right. And the FBI, have they had shared any of those records?
No, of course not. I wrote to the FBI and asked them for anything on Stripling Junior High, and they came back, no records.
No records.
But let me say this. Somebody knew how sensitive those records were. Otherwise, why in the world, with a presidential assassination, why would anybody be interested in junior high school records of a 7 or 8 week period 9 years earlier? What importance of that in less than 24 hours of the assassination? Why do you send people to get those records? Somebody knew. Somebody had advanced knowledge. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone there. And do we know it was the FBI? We don't know who it was. We know that two men showed up, showed ID to Frank Cudlady, and that was it. We don't know who they were for sure. Frank did not write their names down. Frank did not have a copy machine to copy the records. Frank didn't think to ask the people who he gave the records to sign a receipt. And at that time, all the records were held by the individual schools, generally in their basements. But duplicate records, they're all over. You've got all kinds of indications that you had two Oswalds in the military. You had Oswalds in Florida and in New Orleans when Oswald was in Russia. It just goes on and on. I'd like to talk briefly, Lenny, share some thoughts with you about the FBI and the Warren Commission and their handling of various events and witnesses related to the Kennedy assassination. After reviewing and reading literally hundreds of FBI reports, Warren Commission transcripts, and so on, you begin to see a pattern that has developed in the way these people have approached the assassination. And by that I mean, in an ordinary investigation of the assassination of the president, certain things should be done quite promptly and quite quickly. The autopsy is a perfect example. But what I find is when an investigative agency like the FBI, who was put in charge of the investigation by Johnson, in fact, before they were put in charge of the investigation by President Johnson, I don't remember when that happened, but I think it was a day or two later, directed the FBI to head up the investigation, but I don't know if it was a day or two later. Anyway, that's not a big issue. The issue is that crucial parts of Oswald's background, which should have had very little significance, were jumped on by the FBI, I mean, instantly. And specifically, I'm talking about his employment as a teenager. Within hours of the assassination, less than 24 hours, you had FBI agents, at least alleged FBI agents, people who identified themselves as FBI agents, at Stripling Junior High School in Fort Worth, retrieving Oswald's junior high school records. Of course, the purpose of that is that Harvey attended Stripling while Lee was attending Beauregard in New Orleans, and you can't have duplicate records. The day following the assassination, on Saturday, you had FBI agents interviewing the owners of the Pfister Dental Laboratory in New Orleans. They took each individual owner in a separate room and each employee into a separate room, questioned them separately, and told them they were not to discuss the assassination among themselves with anyone at any time. They took all of the employment records, and they've never been seen again. When you find out that it was Century Arms who sold the imported rifles, sold rifles to Klein's, and you have the president of Century Arms, Feldsot, calling the FBI, I believe it was the evening of the assassination, and telling them that rifle C2766 had been sold by his company in June of 1962. That's pretty strong. Yet that's overlooked because the rifle was not shipped to Oswald until February of 1963. When you have agents that appear at Klein's Sporting Goods, once again, within hours of the assassination, I think within 12 hours of the assassination, you've got two agents that were at Klein's. Now, these agents looked through microfilm records. There's no indication whatsoever that they found anything. They simply asked Klein's vice president, William Waldman, if they could take the tapes, the microfilms, which they did. Those microfilms were never returned, but the FBI did provide documentation which suggests or appears to show that Oswald purchased a rifle. Now, those are paper documents. The original microfilm is missing. What does that prove? Very little.
Anybody could have copied.
Anybody could have copied it. There are so many items of evidence that were jumped on immediately by the FBI. The rifle's not one of those that should not have been jumped on. It should have been. But when you get into Oswald's school records at junior high, when you get into his employment as a teenager, then you start to realize that somebody had to have known about the two Oswalds. Otherwise, what are they doing getting those records within a day of the assassination? Anyway, when you start to look at the way John Hart Ely investigated Oswald's background, he found a lot of discrepancies, a lot of duplications he didn't understand. I mentioned the Marines when he talked about Alan Graff and the fact that Oswald was at the Marine Corps Air Facility in California, but all the other records and all the other FBI reports had placed Oswald at Max 9 at the Santa Ana facility. You've got the problem with Taiwan that Blakey addressed. The Warren Commission really didn't address that problem. They simply said he was in Taiwan and forgot looking at the military records. But what you do notice is the way the FBI investigates people. And what they have done is, in simple terms, go through the Warren volumes and you will find that the FBI interviewed people who knew Oswald and school teachers in grade school. Now, when you come to New York, in fact, not only did they interview people who knew Lee Oswald in grade school, They have photographs of every class, first grade, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, all of his classroom photographs. Come to New York, and what have you got? Nothing. Find me an interview with one student who knew him in New York. Just one. Find me a class photograph. Just one. Find me an interview with any one of his teachers. Now, there was an interview with one teacher, but they dropped the ball there in New York. The reason for that is that she had two people in New York at the same time, Harvey and Lee. You get back to Beauregard. What do they do with Myra DeRoos? They interview her, but they don't interview her and report the interview that she told them, the things that she told them, they didn't report. When I showed Myra DeRoos's FBI interview to her, she said, that's not what I told this fellow. Told him things that were completely different.
So she had not bothered to read her own report?
Oh, no. Very few people read their own reports. How would they? The FBI does a report. It goes to FBI headquarters. How are you going to get a copy of it? When you get into Oswald's teenage employment, that becomes a real issue. When you have Frank DiBenedetto saying that, Tujax, have Frank DiBenedetto saying that Oswald worked for Tujax a year to a year and a half, that is a problem. Because there's not enough time for Oswald to work at the other places and still work at Tujax. When you have the FBI interviewing people who knew Oswald in the Marines, what you will notice is they focused on both of the Oswalds, but separately. And here's what I mean by that. They show that Oswald went into the Marine Corps, Camp Pendleton, California, ITR training in Jacksonville, and so on. But they also had a report of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Aviation Fundamental School in Memphis, Tennessee, through Alan Feld. They didn't investigate that at all. What if they had? What if they had gone to the Aviation Fundamental School? What if they got a roster of all the people that were with Oswald at the Aviation Fundamental School? At the same time, another Oswald was at Jacksonville. They ignored it. Now, they made a mistake by publishing Oswald's military records and the transcript of Daniel Patrick Powers, who read his Marine orders into the Warren Report and gave us a different class number and a different course number of the radar schools. Then, of course, there's the Taiwan episode. Did they interview anybody in Taiwan? They had. They should have asked Lieutenant Rhodes, who was with Oswald in Taiwan, and got a list there. They should have looked at those medical records and said, "What's going on here? How can he be at the hospital and be in Taiwan at the same time?" They didn't do that. You go to Japan. Okay, he learned Russian. Fine. Where did he learn Russian? Interview the people that knew Oswald in Japan. That's real critical. And here's the critical part. If you look at the FBI interviews of the Marines who knew Oswald, guess where 90%, 95% of them are? California. Max 9. There's Zach Stout, Bobby Warren, George Hans Wilkins, Oswald's best friend. No interviews with those people. Find me some interviews of Marines who bunked with Oswald, described Oswald in Japan. They aren't there. There was one Marine, he was interviewed by a JFK researcher, and he flat said the person that I was with in Japan was not the person that was accused of killing the president. The person I was with was 3 to 4 inches taller, weighed 30 to 40 pounds more than the fellow I saw on TV, just wasn't him. They focused on the Oswald in California and totally ignored the Oswald that was in Japan, because that was the person who defected to Russia. That's the person who was accused of killing the president. You can go back to Oswald's mother, and it's the same type of interviews. They focused on Marguerite Oswald in the 1940s. They had lists of where she lived, her employers, way back in the 1940s. Now, when it gets into the 1950s, you've got one woman who wears the nurse's uniform and always works for cash, never has a regular job. So they can't really pinpoint this person, so they use the real Margaret Oswald, and they use her up to the mid-50s. Then, instead of interviewing all the people that she worked for in Fort Worth, that I think we've talked about before, the Clyde Campbell's Men's Store, the Paul Shoe Store, and so on and so forth, they don't interview any of those people, and they instead focus on the short, dumpy Marguerite Oswald. So what you have is a transformation of the tall Marguerite into the short one, and the tall Lee into the shorter Harvey. And they totally, in the FBI, to a great extent, ignored all witnesses who could have helped solve this problem if they simply would have interviewed people who knew the real Marguerite Oswald in the late 50s and early 60s. You read the Warren volumes, and it's supposed to be based upon documentation. And I did read the 26 volumes. I read it 16 years ago. I read every volume, and I read the report. And as I was reading the volumes, there were certain things in there that just didn't make sense. It's very interesting when John Pick was shown the photograph of Oswald standing in front of the Bronx Zoo, and he says, "That's not my brother." The Warren Commission attorney questioned him, "That's not your brother?" And John Pick replies, "No, sir." What does it mean when a brother refuses to identify a photograph that's allegedly of his brother? That's interesting. Now, there's no question you read various height discrepancies in Oswald, color of hair, color of eyes, and so on. That's a little bit less conclusive than his brother saying this particular photograph is not my brother. The next was the language. For years, of course, Marina has said that Oswald spoke perfect Russian with a Baltic accent. He would have been 19 when he allegedly taught himself to speak Russian. So this idea that Oswald taught himself Russian was just foreign to me. It just didn't make any sense. And then, with that thought in the back of my mind, constantly looking for any reference. Of course, there's references to the Monterey School of Languages in California. Fine. There's references the Warren Commission said he was studying Russian with an officer in Japan. Fine. Where are those references? Then when you start reconstructing his life in the military, you can do it on a day-by-day basis simply from looking at the Warren volumes and their publishing of the Marine records. Where in the world did he have time? Where did he have a few days, except for leave, military leave? Where did he have time to study Russian, and where did he go? Is there one single person that said they saw Oswald at the Monterey School of Languages? Is there one person in Japan who said that he was speaking Russian with an officer? Well, there's nobody. So what I'm getting at is when you find one discrepancy, and then you find another, and then you find another, and then you find another, and I could go on. Robert Oswald said he attended Stripling Junior High School, duplicate school records. He's supposed to be in the youth house for truancy, but yet his school records show that he had a near perfect attendance record. Robert Oswald talked about him working at Two Jacks. I interviewed the man at Two Jacks, Frank DiBenedetto, his boss, said he worked for Two Jacks a year to a year and a half. The Warren volumes, look at them, they say he worked for Two Jacks only a couple of months. So these are wide discrepancies, and they don't make sense. And as I read the Warren volumes, I continued to find discrepancies again and again and again and again and again. I don't care whether it's Palmer McBride saying he was with Oswald in 1958 in New Orleans when Oswald was in Japan in the military, whether it's Alan Feld who said he was with Oswald in Memphis, Tennessee when Oswald was supposed to be on a ship to Japan. It goes on and on and on and on and on. The obvious things that are known, and I didn't spend much time at it. Oswald at a shooting range when Oswald's supposed to be with his wife in Irving, Texas. Oswald buying a car when he's supposed to be at another location. So this is preceding the assassination. My point is that there are so many of these discrepancies that you become intrigued, and then your mind, at least my mind, turned to the point where I was looking for discrepancies. And there are lots of them. One thing leads to another. Oswald, to me, I don't speak Russian. I don't know anybody who does speak Russian. And Oswald's whole time in Russia is kind of, because of the language problem, is kind of a mystery, as it were. In the 1990s, late 1990s, or mid-1990s, I can't remember, I read an article that was translated from Spanish about a woman who lived in Argentina, Anita Zeiger. I recognized the name. Her father was Oswald's boss at the factory where he worked in Minsk. Talked to her on the phone through an interpreter, made arrangements to go down and see her. Didn't have any idea of the questions to ask her or what I was looking for. It's just that I had an opportunity to meet someone who knew this man for a year and a half, or during the time he was in Russia. They took him to the train station when he left. I got on the plane with my friend interpreter, and we flew to Argentina. And it was nice. She invited us to her house, gave us some little drinks called mate. She had some photographs which she showed us that she had taken in Russia of various people, Oswald included. Just basically talked about Oswald and Marina. And nothing was substantiative. Nothing was revealing. Nothing was, oh my gosh. The second day, just as an off-the-cuff, offhanded remark, she was talking about her language abilities, and I said, well, how was Oswald's Russian? And she turned to me, and with just the only word I can come up with is startled. A startled expression. She looked at me, kind of raised her eyebrows and said, what? No, he didn't speak any Russian. And I was caught off guard, because in my mind, the only thing I'd ever heard year after year after year was the words of Marina. He spoke Russian with a Baltic accent. Perfect Russian. And of course, Marina's remarks are substantiated by the people that they knew in Dallas in the White Russian community, one by one in the Warren volumes, describing Oswald's ability to speak Russian as perfect. George de Mohrenschildt said he preferred to reading classical Russian literature as opposed to reading English. You don't learn that by teaching yourself Russian at age 19 in the military. It just doesn't make any sense. So my point is, and I don't mean to take a long time or make this bigger than it is, but my point is, as the weeks and months go by, and as I read FBI reports or the Warren volumes or interview witnesses, one after another things just don't make sense. And there are very few situations that I investigated where it came to a dead end. Probably the dead end, if you will, was when I called John Pick in Lynn Haven, Florida, and I asked him about his remark to the Warren Commission about the fact that this photograph was not his brother. And as I've stated before, Pick said, I gave my testimony to the Warren Commission in 1964. I'll stand by that and have nothing further to say. So there's nothing I could do but say thank you and hang up the phone. In so many words, he confirmed that his testimony to the Warren Commission was accurate. He didn't say, John, that was not my brother. He simply said, I gave my testimony to the Warren Commission. I'll stand by that and have nothing further to say. You know, when you read things in the Warren volumes that don't make sense, then that's where I look and I try and find an answer. You wonder about these things. For example, Life magazine. You open Life magazine, there's Oswald. He does not look like the Oswald that that was accused of shooting the president. Big husky kid in a classroom. Well, looks like he's got a missing tooth. Then I remember from reading the Warren volumes that Ed Vogel said he took the photograph. And he sold it to Life magazine for $75. And he said he thought he helped patch Lee up after a fight, and he thought he broke a tooth or lost a tooth from that fight. There's another lead. What do? No dental records. All you got's Vogel. So I go to Marina. And I asked Marina if she could loan me the x-rays from the autopsy. And she did. And she even gave me photographs of part of Oswald's skull with the teeth. They're dirty and gritty and green, but they're clear, very clear. He had natural teeth. The fellow in the photograph appears to have a missing tooth. I have not, to this day, seen an end to the discrepancies. I looked at a few of these documents, and one of the things I found was a medical report of Oswald in California at Max 9. What was interesting is the date on that medical record was at a time, I believe it was a day or even 2 days before the Marine Corps records show that Oswald in Japan boarded a ship in Yokosuka for the 3-week voyage to San Francisco. So it's a small thing, but it's another document that shows Harvey was at Max 9 while Lee Oswald was still in Yokosuka, Japan. And these things continue and continue and continue and continue. We've all heard about Roger Craig saying Oswald got into a Rambler. Nope. The Warren Commission says he got into a bus. When you follow those leads out, it takes you someplace. We've all heard that a person who was wearing a white shirt was taken out of the back of the Texas Theater shortly after, or at the time, Harvey Oswald was taken out the front of the Texas Theater by the Dallas police and put into a squad car. We've all heard about that. We've all heard about Oswald, a man identified as Oswald, driving a red Ford Falcon 20, 30 minutes after the assassination when Harvey was in jail. We've all heard about these things. All I have done is simply try to lay the documents side by side. He's here. No, he's here. If you've got Harvey in jail, you put him in one column. You've got somebody driving this red Ford Falcon, call him Lee if you will, put him in another column. And then go backwards and start separating these people to the best of your ability. The guy in the classroom photograph with a broken tooth, the thin guy standing in front of the Bronx Zoo, John Pick says was not his brother, put him in the Harvey column. The people that were introduced to Harvey Oswald introduced himself to William Timmer in North Dakota in 1953. Timmer says he wanted to be called Harv. First indication I heard of the name Harvey. That's why I used Harvey for one of them. He, Lee Harvey Oswald, told William Timmer in 1953 he wanted to be called Harv. 6 months later, he's in Myra Derousse's home class, and Myra Derousse says, "How do you want to be called?" He says, "Harvey, call me Harvey." So Myra Derousse always calls him Harvey. So you go through these things. Beauregard school records, 2 people. Myra says he was in her homeroom class. Harvey, no question. But the report cards show that you also had an Oswald in homeroom class 303 on the 3rd floor of Beauregard. So you put all these things side by side, and you have 2 different people using the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, in Beauregard, it might seem just absolutely astounding that you would have 2 people in the 8th grade use the name Lee Harvey Oswald in the same school. Well, we all have probably known someone, if our school is any size at all, and Beauregard was a decent-sized school, that had the same last name. Smith, Jones, Williams, whatever. And they had different first names. Nobody thinks twice about that, do they? If you had a John Williams in one class, and in another class there's a Paul Williams, would you think that they're brothers related or anything? So if you've got Harvey Oswald in Myra Derousse's class, he's a short, little, thin guy, and you've got Lee Oswald on the 3rd floor homeroom class, he's a big husky guy who gets in fights. Why associate those people? What would be the reason to associate those people? Now you see, what interested me one step further, let's go one step further. I have an interview that Ed Vogel gave to the local television station in New Orleans, and this was very shortly after the assassination. And I listened to it very closely. Vogel's talking about Lee Oswald, Lee Oswald, Lee Oswald, Lee Oswald, Lee Oswald. Lee wouldn't take anything from anybody. Lee would not back down from a fight, and so on. Now that's not Harvey, who Myra Derousse says didn't have an ounce of fight in him. But Myra Derousse said very clearly that it was Harvey Oswald in her classroom, and his best friend was Ed Vogel. Ed Vogel comes running out of the basement. Miss Derousse, a piano fell on Harvey's legs. So Dorothy Duvik and I, we go into the basement, and there, in the middle of the room, is Harvey with a piano on his legs. So we lifted up the piano, and that was that. So now we've got Myra Derousse knowing Harvey, and Harvey and Vogel rode their bicycles together every day, according to Myra Derousse. Now we've got Vogel knowing Harvey Oswald. And a week after the assassination, we've got an interview with a local TV station, and Ed Vogel talking about his friendship with Lee Oswald, who he attended CAP meetings with in the summer of 1955, a year and a few months after he knew Harvey. He talked about Lee getting in a fight with Johnny Newmeyer. I talked to John Newmeyer. He was in Las Vegas. He remembered the fight clearly. Doesn't know if he broke Oswald's tooth, but said they fought for hours, a couple hours. And his brother got involved too, Johnny Newmeyer's younger brother. Anyway, what you've got is Ed Vogel clearly, according to Myra Derousse, knowing Harvey. And then you've got Vogel, by his own admission, knowing Lee. You've got a very, very dangerous situation with Ed Vogel. Ed Vogel died in 1972, I believe. His father told the House Select Committee, when this House Select Committee tried to find Vogel, that he thought his son died under strange circumstances, he asked him to please investigate because he thought his son's death had something to do with the assassination of President Kennedy and his friendship with Oswald. So my take on that is, obviously, Vobel was silenced, and he happened to die. And this is something else. If you look at Vobel's death certificate, so I talked to his sister. His sister, her name is Sweetie Pie. Vobel had two sisters, and they still operate the Quality Florists shop in New Orleans, the same shop that they operated when Vobel was alive. His family operated. They still have the same flower shop. And she told me the story. He called one day from the Ochsner Clinic and said that he was not feeling good. He was in the hospital. They were going to admit him to the hospital, and they needed to do tests. But he was feeling fine. He'd be home the next day. Vobel died at the Ochsner Hospital, and that was it. He didn't die at this other memorial hospital as the death certificate states. But you see, what we're dealing with is a document. And people 50 years from now would simply look at the document and say, oh, he died at this hospital. Whereas the real truth can be had from the sisters of Ed Vobel. He didn't die at this hospital. He died at the Ochsner Clinic. And people familiar with the Kennedy assassination know about Alton Ochsner. So my point is, and I know I'm belaboring the point, but my point is, almost every avenue that I investigate has a further lead, a further something that leads you like a tree branch to a big tree branch to two smaller ones and smaller ones. It just keeps going, and it almost never ends. Well, it's my hope that I can provide a foundation. My research, my documentation will provide in the future a foundation for someone to gather up my materials and further this work. I don't consider it my work, I just consider it documents. So if a person has a particular interest in a particular area related to Harvey or Lee, get these documents from the Baylor website. See if you can expand on it and do your own research. Now, there is an end to this research. I mean, I'm sure in the National Archives, if I spent the next 3 or 4 years at the National Archives 1 month out of the year like I did for many years, I'm sure, without a doubt, I could come up with more items of interest, whether it be FBI manipulation of witnesses, Warren Commission changing testimony, direct testimony of their witnesses, whether it's indications of two Oswalds, whatever. But let me just say this. All of the research into Harvey and Lee, everything I've accomplished, could end with one DNA test. And of course, that's between any member of Robert Oswald's family and any member of Marina's family. If those DNA tests were to show that those people are not related, then you have Harvey and you have Lee, who are not brothers.
I went to the hotel that night. I spent hours in bed rolling that over in my head. Somebody's lying. Is it Marina? What language was Marina and he talking? My God, English. And then, of course, the question would be, where the hell did a 19-year-old girl in the middle of Russia learn to speak English? KGB. That's enough for me. They were speaking English in Russia, not Russian. Let me tell you, she was KGB. A great deal of the documentation found in the Warren volumes and at the National Archives does not tell us what occurred either before or during the assassination of President Kennedy. During the past 50 years, we have learned that many of these documents were either altered, fabricated, or simply created in order to incriminate Lee Harvey Oswald as the assassin to the exclusion of everyone else. The statements of witnesses, as recorded in FBI reports, were often not what those witnesses told the FBI. First-hand accounts of many witnesses who knew and spent a considerable amount of time with Oswald were never asked to testify before the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board. Testimony from Oswald's own brothers, Robert Oswald and John Pick, as to his identity and whereabouts was often ignored. When Lee Harvey Oswald's own brother is shown a photograph of Oswald, on 2 separate occasions he says, "That's not my brother," doesn't that raise some kind of a question? Well, if it isn't your brother, who is it? And the commission just ignored it. When we examine and interview those same witnesses, read their statements, and look at the documents and evidence used by the commission, a very different story emerges. Or what does it mean to anyone when, within hours of the assassination, the FBI suddenly knows where Oswald was working when he was 16 years old, where Oswald went to junior high when he was 14 years old, and they send agents to get those school records? So what does that mean? To me, it means that the FBI had prior knowledge. Dozens and dozens of items of evidence were used to incriminate Oswald, but many of these items were not found by the Dallas police, and their origin is unknown. Time and time again, we see that original documents were destroyed while in FBI custody. We see that FBI agents were knowingly sent to collect information and documents from erroneous sources. And, believe it or not, the FBI gave very, very few documents to the Warren Commission, original documents. Nearly all the documents given to the Commission were either paper copies or photographs of documents. And nearly all original documents collected by the FBI were destroyed while in their custody. The alteration, fabrication, and disappearance of evidence began within hours of the assassination. The overwhelming problem faced by J. Edgar Hoover was to immediately disguise and cover up the existence of two Oswalds. One of these young men was born in New Orleans in 1939 and given the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Throughout his young life, Lee was husky, well-built, and often the tallest boy in his classroom. Lee Oswald had an older brother named Robert Oswald and an older half-brother named John Pick. Lee Oswald's mother was a tall, well-dressed, nice-looking woman. The other young man, he was small, thin, and appeared to be underfed. He was raised and cared for by a short, heavy-set, unfriendly woman I call the Marguerite Oswald imposter. But this young man had one very important quality that would eventually prove useful to our intelligence agencies. He spoke, read, and understood the Russian language. In 1947, Walter and Georgia Bell were building their home on San Saba Street in Benbrook, just outside of Fort Worth. The FBI interviewed Georgia Bell and reported that the Oswalds lived across the street in 1948. I met Georgia Bell in the 1990s and showed her the FBI report. Georgia said, "That's not what I told them. I told them Mrs. Oswald lived at that house in 1947, not 1948. Georgia remembered Marguerite Oswald as short and fat. Marguerite didn't have a car and would often ask Lucille Hubbard, or me, to drive her to the store and to other places. One time Lucille drove her to a house next to Stripling School, where she had lots of furniture and clothes. Now this house, located at 2220 Thomas Place, is significant. The short, fat Marguerite Oswald lived there in 1947, in 1954, and again in 1963 when President Kennedy was assassinated. Now people are probably wondering why the year 1947 is relevant, 16 years before the assassination. It is relevant because Lee Oswald's older brother, John Pick, said they never lived in a house on San Saba. Pick told the Warren Commission, "I don't know nothing about San Saba." In the summer of 1947, John Pick, his mother, and brothers Robert and Lee Oswald were living at 1505 8th Avenue in Fort Worth. Lee was in the first grade at Lily Clayton Elementary School. In June, John Pick got a job, a summer job, at the Tex Gold Ice Cream Parlor 5 blocks south of their home, and was soon promoted to assistant manager. Robert Oswald discussed family matters in detail during his Warren Commission testimony. But when asked about the summer of 1947, Commission member Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA, asked for an adjournment. Dulles was likely concerned that Robert, like John Pick, would say that his family was living at 1505 8th Avenue during the summer of 1947, which would conflict with a second Oswald family living at 101 San Saba at the same time. After the adjournment, Robert Oswald's testimony resumed, and he was questioned about events that occurred in 1948. No questions were asked about the summer of 1947. The Warren Commission ignored John Pick and avoided asking Robert Oswald questions about where the family was living in 1947. The FBI changed the date that Georgia Bell said the Oswalds lived across the street from 1947 to 1948. The commission accepted the FBI report and concluded the Oswalds had lived at San Saba in 1948 and thereby avoided the problem of two Oswald families living in two different locations at the same time. The story of the Oswald family living in two different places in 1947 is just the beginning. There are dozens of such examples which can take a great deal of time and effort to examine and understand. But when pieced together year after year, the undeniable fact is there were two young boys, and later two young men, who used the name Lee Harvey Oswald. Dates and details, again and again, year after year, can be very dull and tedious. But the devil's in the details, and these details are the only way to follow the lives of these two people. A close examination of how they were able to merge the identities of these two young boys demonstrates both the FBI's knowledge and their involvement in the cover-up. During his Warren Commission testimony, John Pick said that Lee was enrolled in a school between 89th and 90th Streets and between 2nd and 3rd Avenue, only a couple of blocks from Pick's apartment. Robert Oswald, who visited his mother and brother when they lived in New York City, said, quote, Lee entered the 8th grade at Public School 44 on Columbus Avenue at 76th Street, which is 2.5 miles from the Pick's apartment. Now, both John Pick and Robert Oswald said Lee Oswald, their brother, attended junior high school in Manhattan, but the FBI and Warren Commission ignored both of their brothers. Instead of checking into this Manhattan school record, the FBI gave the Warren Commission photographic copies of Oswald's school records in the Bronx, but never in Manhattan, as reported by John Pick and Robert Oswald. Mrs. Dorrit Wolf was an art teacher in Public School 117 in the Bronx, and she remembered young Oswald as one of her 7th grade students. She described him as very small, introverted, very intelligent, and said that he constantly truanted. This was Harvey Oswald, very different from John Pick's brother, the tall, husky, well-built Lee Oswald, who lived with Pick and his wife when they first arrived in New York. Harvey Oswald's truancy came to the attention of the Bureau of Attendance. On March 12th, a petition for delinquency was filed, and on April 15th, Oswald was adjudged a school truant. The following day, he was arrested and taken to domestic relations court and remanded to the youth house until May 7th. At youth house, Harvey Oswald scored 118 on an IQ test, considerably higher than the IQ of 102 that Lee Oswald received in Fort Worth a year earlier. The young boy in youth house was obviously Harvey Oswald. Harvey Oswald told Dr. Kurian that he never went to school, but on occasion his brother would substitute for him and take his place in school. But at this time his older brother was in the Marines, and brother John Pick was married and in the Coast Guard. When Harvey Oswald told Dr. Kurian that his brother sometimes took his place in school, could he have been referring to Lee Oswald? With the two school records for Harvey and Lee merged together, it was easy to see that Lee Oswald attended public school full-time. But how to account for Harvey Oswald's chronic truancy on the same school record? The FBI provided photographs of the Public School 44 school records to the Commission, but all of the New York school records, the original records, disappeared while in FBI custody. There's a 6th grade classroom photograph taken of Lee Oswald in 1952 in Fort Worth. A year later, Robert Oswald took a photograph of the young, small, slender Harvey at the Bronx Zoo. But when the Warren Commission showed the Bronx Zoo photo to John Pick, he replied, "Sir, from that photo, I could not recognize that that is Lee Harvey Oswald." John Pick refused to identify Harvey Oswald as his brother. Pick told the Commission, under oath, that the boy in the photo was not his brother, but nobody listened. I telephoned John Pick in Lynn Haven, Florida, and asked him about his refusal to identify Harvey Oswald as his brother. Pick replied, "I gave my testimony to the Warren Commission. I stand by that and have nothing further to say." I would like to share a bit of information about Harvey Oswald's short, heavy-set caretaker. The Margaret Oswald imposter did her best to find employment where she could be paid in cash. She avoided providing a Social Security number, avoided being subjected to withholding tax, and avoided credit bureaus. She did everything she could to avoid creating duplicate records for Marguerite Oswald. It should come as no surprise that Margaret Oswald's federal income tax returns remain classified to this day. While Harvey Oswald was at Youth House, John Caro interviewed the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter. This Marguerite told Caro that Oswald's father died at age 45, when in fact he died at age 42. She said that she was married on July 19, 1929, when in fact Margaret Clavery and Robert E. Lee Oswald were married on July 15, 1933, and it was a second marriage for both. She gave an incorrect date for Oswald's birthday, and then mistakenly identified her sister as Lillian Segore, when in fact her sister's name was Lillian Moret. This impostor told Caro that her son was baptized at the Trinity Lutheran Church, but Lee Oswald was baptized at the Redeemer Lutheran Church in New Orleans. These are just a few of the errors made by the Marguerite Oswald impostor during her interview with John Caro. The Marguerite Oswald impostor made many, many errors that the real Marguerite Oswald would never have made. Going into an interview with a probation officer, you really have no idea what they're going to ask, although you could suspect they were going to ask information about a background. She knew, apparently from the interview, that Lee Oswald was born in New Orleans. He was Lutheran. She was married before. His father died when he was young. She knew some of it. She just didn't know the details. I'll tell you something you might find very interesting in Marguerite Oswald's testimony. She was reading from notes about her background during her testimony, and she even states that. Excuse me, I think I've got that in my notes somewhere here. And my notes were given to me by I can't remember the guy's name, but he worked for Life magazine. Some guy had compiled notes on Marguerite Oswald's background and Lee Harvey Oswald's background and given them to her before she testified. In January 1954, Harvey Oswald enrolled as a full-time student. He walked into Myra DeRousse's 8th grade homeroom in the basement cafeteria, and she remembered the day she met young Oswald. Myra told me, "Well, the first day I came into my homeroom, he handed me his file. When I read his name was Lee Harvey Oswald, I said to him, 'How do you want to be called?' He told me to call him Harvey, so I always called him Harvey. I only knew him as Harvey." After listening to Myra again and again call him Harvey, 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 I began referring to the smaller, thinner, quiet Oswald as Harvey. Myra described young Harvey as a little scrawny fellow, skinny and quiet. He came to the middle of my chest, about 4'6" tall, and didn't have an ounce of fight in him. Myra saw Harvey nearly every day before school, sitting on the front steps, waiting for the school to open, and thought he was lonely. Myra saw Harvey every day in her homeroom class, in the school library, and after school riding bicycles on the school grounds with Ed Vobel. On one occasion, after school, Ed Vobel ran up to Myra and shouted, Mr. Roos, come quick, come quick. A piano fell on Harvey." Myra and fellow teacher Dorothy Duvick followed Vobel into the basement cafeteria and found Harvey on the floor with a small upright piano laying across his legs. Myra drove Harvey to the Monolepry Clinic on Canal Street. After examination by a physician, Myra drove Harvey to his home on Exchange Alley. He asked where his mother was. Harvey replied, "She's working at the bar." Lee Oswald and his tall, nice-looking mother were living at 1454 St. Mary Street. The apartment building was owned by Julian and Myrtle Evans, who had known the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Oswald for over 20 years. Julian Evans told the Warren Commission that Marguerite Oswald, quote, was a beautiful woman with black hair, a real fashion plate, who dressed beautifully. But when Mr. Evans saw the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter following the assassination on television, he said, "When we saw her on television just recently, after all this happened, she looked just awful. You wouldn't have recognized her if they hadn't told you who she was. She looked that different." In the spring of 1954, as strange as it may seem, the short, quiet Harvey Oswald and the much taller, huskier Lee Oswald both attended Beauregard Junior High during the spring of 1954. I showed Myra the photo of Harvey Oswald taken at the Bronx Zoo in 1953 in New York. She said, "That's him, just like I remember him." I then showed Myra a photo Ray had taken at Beauregard that appeared in Life magazine. Myra looked at the photo a long time and then said, "That's not Harvey. That's not the boy from my homeroom. Look at this boy. He looks like a football player, and Harvey was skinny." After school ended in June, Myra never saw Harvey again. In October, the tall, husky, well-built Lee Oswald got into a fight with Johnny Newmeyer and Mike Newmeyer. Ed Vogel witnessed the fight and then helped clean up Lee Oswald. A few days later, Ed Vogel was with Lee Oswald on the steps of Beauregard when a young man named Robin Riley punched Lee in the mouth, cutting his lip badly. Once again, Vogel helped clean up Lee Oswald, and their friendship began to develop. 7 months later, in May 1955, Vogel attended a pre-high school conference with Lee Oswald at Warren Easton High School. As their friendship developed, Vogel began visiting Oswald's mother, who he described as tall and nice-looking. After the assassination, Vogel saw the Marguerite Oswald imposter's photo on TV and in the newspaper. He told the Warren Commission, "I had a picture in my mind which is very different from what I saw her in the papers after all this happened. I didn't recognize her." Vogel didn't recognize the Marguerite Oswald imposter as the nice-looking mother of Lee Oswald. A month later, in June 1955, Vogel and Lee began to attend Civil Air Patrol meetings. Ed Vogel was one of the only few people who knew both Harvey and Lee. He died very unexpectedly at the young age of 31 at the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans. Harvey Oswald's junior high school records from Stripling were confiscated by the FBI within 20 hours of the assassination and never seen again. The Stripling school records and the testimony of many of the students who knew Oswald at Stripling could have exposed Harvey and Lee. Harvey and the Marguerite Oswald imposter left 126 Exchange in April 1955. It appears they moved to 120 North Telemachus Street, which is just off Canal. Now, when I researched the land records of 120 North Telemachus, I was astonished to learn that this property was owned by a woman named Margaret Keating. Margaret Keating was the first wife of Robert E. Lee Oswald, the father of Lee Harvey Oswald. In January 1956, while Lee Oswald was working at Two Jacks, Harvey Oswald worked briefly at the J.R. Michaels Company. Now, what's interesting, I visited the J.R. Michaels Company. I met with Nick Mazza, who was the manager and then the owner of J.R. Michaels. And I asked Nick, I said, "Nick, did you know Frank DiBenedetto?" He said, "Sure, Frank and I went to lunch almost every day." I said, "Well, could Lee Oswald have worked up there and for you at the same time?" "That's impossible." He said, "They're right up above, one floor above us." "No, it's impossible." So that told me that it was Harvey working for Nick Mazza while Lee was working upstairs for Two Jacks. In the spring of 1956, while Lee Oswald was working at Two Jacks, the Warren Commission tells us that Oswald worked at the Pfister Dental Laboratory. None of this was true. In reality, Lee Oswald worked continuously for over a year at Two Jacks, while Harvey attended Warren Easton High School and then worked briefly at J.R. Michaels. He never worked at Pfister's in 1956. The day of the assassination, Two Jack employee Jimmy Hudnall told me that the FBI arrived that afternoon. Lee Oswald's payroll records and pay stubs from Two Jacks were confiscated by the FBI and disappeared. But the Bureau knew there was a problem. School records showed that Harvey Oswald had attended Warren Easton High School from September 10th through October 10th, 1955. And the Bureau knew that Harvey had worked briefly for J.R. Michaels in January 1956. The Bureau soon realized that the only time one Lee Harvey Oswald could have worked for Two Jacks was after he quit Warren Easton on October 10th. The Bureau then carefully selected time cards which appeared to show that Oswald began working at Two Jacks after he dropped out of Warren Easton, but before he began working at J.R. Michaels in 1956. The FBI had now merged Harvey Oswald's school records, and employment records together with Lee Oswald's employment at Two Jacks. The FBI then took photographs of Oswald's attendance at Warren Easton, photographs of his time cards at Two Jacks, and photographs of an FBI interview with J.R. Michaels' office manager to the Warren Commission. Neither the FBI nor Warren Commission produced a single payroll check, payroll tax records either from Tujague's or the state of Louisiana. Finally, it is very important to realize and remember that all of Oswald's Social Security records from his employment at Dolly Shoe, Tujague's, J.R. Michaels, and the Pfister Dental Laboratory have disappeared. On October 15, 1956, Harvey Oswald enlisted in the Marine Corps. He was 5'8", 135 pounds, and gave his home address as 4936 Collinwood in Fort Worth. Now, the Collinwood address is very, very important. It's important because that's where Harvey Oswald and the Marguerite Oswald imposter and Robert Oswald lived in the summer and fall of 1956. This shows you that Robert was very, very involved. On October 24th, Harvey and 3 other Marine crews boarded an American Airlines flight to San Diego. Oswald and the 3 recruits from Dallas were assigned to Platoon 2060, along with a young man from Wisconsin named Alan R. Feld. Following boot camp, they were transferred to Camp Pendleton, California for infantry training. They shared the same tent, and Alan Feld and Harvey Oswald spent a lot of time together. Feld told the FBI that he and Harvey Oswald were together in California until May 1957. Following the assassination, the Dallas police found a 7-page handwritten account of Oswald's background. Harvey wrote that he had served in San Diego, California from October 56 to April 57 and Camp Pendleton in April and May 1957. Alan Feld's statement to the FBI, Harvey Oswald's handwritten chronology, and Marine Corps unit diaries confirmed that Oswald and Feld were in California during this time. But Harvey Oswald and Feld's assignments in California contradict with both Marine Corps records and the Warren Commission, who said that Oswald was in Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville, Florida in March, April, and May. Lee Oswald. In the fall of 1956, while Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld were stationed at San Diego, Lee Oswald was stationed in El Toro, California. It was here that 2 Marine Corps sergeants met Private First Class Lee Oswald. Sergeant Wallace Ransberger worked with Lee Oswald in San Diego, and a year later knew him in Atsugi, Japan. In early 1957, Sergeant Donald Goodwin was assigned to the 5th Marine Division at Camp Pendleton and supervised Private First Class Lee Oswald, a radio communicator. The statements of these 2 Marine sergeants is important because according to the Warren Commission records, Oswald was never a private first class and never in the 5th Marine Division. In February, Lee Oswald took leave. Following his leave, Lee Oswald was assigned to Aviation Fundamental School in Jacksonville from March 18 through May 2nd. After graduating, Lee Oswald and 5 other Marines left Jacksonville by train for Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi to attend radar school. Harvey Oswald attended the same radar school, but at a different time, a different class, and a different course. Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld were transferred to the Naval Air Technical Training Center in Memphis, Tennessee, where they were stationed until early September. According to Marine Corps records published in the Warren volumes, Oswald was never in Memphis, Tennessee, not even for a single day. Yet Alan Feld told the FBI that he and Oswald spent 3 months in Memphis. The Warren Commission dared not interview Alan Feld, whose testimony could easily have exposed Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald in the Marine Corps at the same time. And they dared not ask the FBI to interview Marines who knew and bunked with Oswald at the Naval Technical Training Center in Memphis. In September, while Lee Oswald was aboard the USS Bexar en route to Japan, Harvey Oswald and Alan Feld were still in Memphis. In September, Alan Feld was transferred to Opelika, Florida, while Harvey went to New Orleans. Alan Feld's 10-month association with Harvey Oswald was now over. The FBI's interview of Alan Feld was published in the Warren volumes, so the Commission knew about Alan Feld. They could have identified and questioned Marines who served with Harvey Oswald at the Naval Technical Training Center in Memphis, Tennessee, while Lee was in California, but they didn't. Harvey Oswald and Allen Feld's assignments directly conflicted with the assignments and whereabouts of Lee Oswald. This is the reason Allen Feld was never questioned by the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board. On September 12th, Lee Oswald arrived in Tsugi, Japan, aboard the USS Bexar. Harvey left the Marine Corps in Memphis. He was soon working at the Pfister Dental Laboratory directly across the street from the Hotel Senator, where he met Palmer McBride. On October 4th, the Russians launched Sputnik, the first satellite into orbit. On this day, Harvey Oswald and co-worker Palmer McBride began discussing Sputnik and Russian space successes. McBride was an 18-year-old high school student and had been working part-time at Pfister Dental Laboratory for 2 years. Palmer was a member of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association, a group of high school students who met regularly on the second and fourth Saturdays of each month. McBride and Oswald became close friends and spent a lot of time together, both during and after work. McBride visited Oswald and his mother in their apartment at the Hotel Senator, which is directly across the street and about 30 feet from the dental laboratory. During one visit to the Oswald's second-floor apartment, McBride met Oswald's mother, who he described as short, heavy-set, gray-haired, and not too friendly. Harvey Oswald visited McBride's house on several occasions, where they often listened to classical music. McBride and Oswald went to the movies together and attended the Boris Godunov Opera. This opera played only twice in New Orleans, on October 10th and 12th, 1957, and both McBride and Oswald were there. In October, while Harvey Oswald was working at the Pfister Dental Lab in New Orleans, Lee Oswald was stationed in Tsugi, Japan. Lee was assigned to bunk on the first level of Barracks 5, a large two-story wood frame building that housed 72 men. Zach Stout remembered the day that Lee Oswald arrived. He and Oswald became close friends and worked together on a daily basis for the next 10 months. I talked with Zach for hours on many occasions. When I asked Zach if he ever saw Oswald read or study Russian, he laughed, and he said, "That's ridiculous. Who makes up these stories?" Lee Oswald never spoke a word of Russian in Japan, nor was he a supporter of communism. Lee Oswald never studied Russian in high school, junior high, or grade school. Harvey's ability to read, speak, and write Russian when he first arrived in Santa Ana, California, is the key to understanding Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald. Yet an Oswald shows up at Max 9 in Santa Ana, California, and suddenly understands, speaks, reads, and writes Russian. And now their 19-year-old Marine was making preparations to defect to the Soviet Union. Some of the Marines who served with Harvey Oswald at Santa Ana also served with him in Taiwan. But most of these Marines remember Harvey because of his interest in anything Russian, which included newspapers, records, and politics. Harvey had less than a year during which to convince fellow Marines of his devotion to communism in preparation for his upcoming defection. Nelson Delgado, Irwin Lewis, Camillus Brown, Buddy Simcoe, Mac Osborne, Neil Tessum, all served with Harvey Oswald during October, November, and December 1958. But during this time, Lee Oswald was still in Japan. The only Oswald who was ever at Max 9 at Santa Ana was Harvey Oswald. Lee Oswald arrived at the 5,000-man jet air base in El Toro, California on December 22nd. Alan Graff told the FBI that he was Oswald's platoon sergeant. Warren Commission attorney John Hart Eli interviewed Graff, who told him that Oswald never studied or spoke a foreign language and was not interested in communism. Graff said that Oswald enjoyed firing a rifle and was rated a high expert shot with a rifle. Now, what did the Warren Commission do about Harvey Oswald at Santa Ana and Lee at El Toro? The Commission ignored the jet base and Marines who served Lee Oswald at El Toro. Instead, they focused their attention almost exclusively on Marines who served with Russian-speaking Harvey at Max 9 at Santa Ana. They interviewed anyone and everyone who remembered Harvey Oswald's fascination with communism and everything Russian. They were trying to find a reason or a motive for Harvey Oswald murdering President Kennedy. A photo was taken of the tall, husky, well-built Lee Oswald by his friend George Wilkins, shortly after he arrived in Japan. Another Marine who knew Lee Oswald during this time was Richard Bullock. Bullock remembered that Oswald was not in the radar section, but was a radio communicator. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, Richard Bullock told family and friends, "The Oswald I knew was not the guy I saw shot by Jack Ruby." Bullock looked at the mugshot of Lee Harvey Oswald taken to the police station shortly after he was arrested and said, "It looks nothing like him. That's not the man I knew in Japan. The Lee Oswald I knew was 30 to 40 pounds heavier and 3 to 4 inches taller than the man accused of killing President Kennedy." Richard Bullock was not asked to testify before the Warren Commission, House Select Committee, or the Assassination Records Review Board.
I saw the records that the Oswald, the real Oswald of the Marine Corps, was taller, eyes different, scars on his body was different.
Then the Oswald that came out,
that was killed by Jack Ruby, certainly.
The Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald said that he never spoke about communism, was not interested in politics, never studied or spoke a foreign language, occasionally got into fights, and was always drinking. Peter Cassisi said Oswald came back from leave several times completely drunk, and Jerry Pitts recalled one night when Oswald was passed out drunk in the parking lot next to the barracks. On October 27th, Richard Sear was standing about 15 yards from the barracks and sounded like a gunshot inside the building. Zach Stout was also there. Sear and other Marines ran into the barracks and found Lee Oswald sitting in his locker with a nickel-plated Derringer laying nearby on the floor. Oswald, with little emotion, said, "It seems as though I've shot myself." Lee Oswald was taken to the hospital at Yokosuka, where a Navy surgeon closed his wound with stitches and allowed the slug, which lay just below the surface on the back of Oswald's upper arm, left arm, to remain in his arm. A week later, the doctor made an incision on the back of Oswald's arm, removed the slug, and closed the wound with stitches. The shooting resulted in 2 scars in Lee Oswald's left arm above his elbow. It was Lee Oswald who had these scars, not Harvey. Neither of these scars were noted by Dr. Earl Rose, who performed the autopsy on Harvey Oswald after he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby in 1963. On November 23rd, only 20 hours after President Kennedy was assassinated, FBI agents arrived at the Pfister Dental Lab. They confiscated employment records and financial records which disappeared. They interviewed 10 employees and instructed each one of them not to discuss the case among themselves or with anyone. James Harrison Vance, who knew Harvey Oswald from both the Dental Lab and the Astronomy Association, was interviewed at length by the FBI. Vance said, "They really shook me up." At the National Archives, there are no payroll records, no canceled payroll checks, no tax withholding records, or any record from the Pfister Dental Laboratory. And all payments made to the Social Security Administration by Pfister Dental Laboratory on Oswald's behalf have disappeared. McBride. Within hours of President Kennedy's assassination, Palmer McBride met with Air Force security officers and told them about his association with Oswald. The following day, FBI agents interviewed McBride for hours. McBride gave the agents a very detailed account of Oswald in New Orleans in 1957-58, which was published in the Warren volumes. But because McBride knew and worked with Harvey Oswald for 8 months in New Orleans, while Lee Oswald was in Japan, he was never asked to testify before the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or the Assassination Records Review Board. Can you imagine what would have happened if McBride had testified before the Warren Commission? Lee Oswald in Japan. The FBI and Warren Commission interviewed only a few Marines who knew Lee Oswald in Japan, and not one of these Marines knew him well. The FBI simply ignored all of the Marines who were close to Lee Oswald in Japan. Not a single one of Zach Stout's group of 10 Marines who bunked with Lee Oswald, worked with him on a daily basis, traveled with him, and went on leave with him. The Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald better than anyone, not one of them was ever interviewed by the Warren Commission. Today, we can only imagine what the Commission's response would have been if Richard Bullock testified that the Oswald he knew in Japan was not the same Oswald killed by Jack Ruby. It is important to remember that Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald in Japan were never interviewed by the Commission. But dozens of these Marines who knew and worked with Lee Oswald in Japan were interviewed by author Edward Epstein. Epstein's interviews and notes were held for years in the Special Collections Department at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. My research friend, Malcolm Blunt, visited the university and asked to see these interviews. Malcolm was told they're not available to the public. A few months later, another research friend, Jones Harris of New York, knew Epstein's publisher and called him at my request. Jones asked if he could have access to these documents. The publisher then telephoned the university and was told these documents have disappeared. Somebody's lying. Is it Marina? You know, I visited Marina at her house, talked to her on the phone, you know, months after months, days after days, hours after hours. And I just always assumed that, you know, Oswald spoke Russian with a Baltic accent, blah, 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 blah. And everybody who listened to her, you know, we've all got to say, oh, Oswald spoke Russian with a Baltic accent. Well, how do you know that? Well, I've read it here and I read it there. Then I go down to Argentina and talk to the people who lived with the Oswalds next door for a year and a half. And as an afterthought, as an after comment, by the way, Miss Zeiger, how well did Oswald speak Russian? And she looked at me like I just asked her to undress, and, you know, big eyes, and what? He never spoke Russian. I said, wait a minute. And she threw me for an absolute loop. I was momentarily stunned. What do you mean he didn't speak Russian? And I said, he didn't speak Russian? No. Not a word? No. And then she said, my father always interpreted for him. And I said, he didn't say, das vidanya, niet, nothing? No. So I went to the hotel that night. I spent hours in bed rolling that over in my head. What's going on here? And I finally realized that, so Oswald didn't speak Russian in Russia. Of course he didn't. He's a spy. Well, if he didn't speak Russian in Russia, what language was Marina and he talking? My God, English. And then, of course, the question would be, where the hell did a 19-year-old girl in the middle of Russia learn to speak English? KGB. And then I thought, I need to confirm this. And I talked to Dick Russell one time, and Dick said, I'm going to interview Robert Webster. Would you like me to ask him any questions? I said, yeah. Ask him if when he met Marina, if she spoke English. And Dick came back and said, yep, she did. Broken, but she spoke English. That's enough for me. They were speaking English in Russia, not Russian. There's a video of a guy on TV, a Russian guy, talking about Marina, saying that she slept with the Afghan ambassador. She needs to be sent her. She's been overlooked. Poor widowed lady for a long time. Let me tell you, she was KGB. And we really don't know who Marina was. We know what's been told to us. We've been told she's got an uncle in the MVD or something, and her mother died when she was... We don't know that. She told Robert Webster that her mother worked in an office factory or something like that in Moscow. She lived with her mother. We really don't know Marina's background at all. It could be anything. Now, don't forget, Marina tried to get married to Webster. She tried to have a relationship with him. And she secretly went to Leningrad. She told Oswald she was going to Odessa, but she went to Leningrad, and she just happened to be staying in an apartment in the same building as Webster was in that huge city of Leningrad, and meets him again. And he doesn't want to have anything to do with her. So, you know, she then simply goes back to Oswald.